When I got my first job as a lawyer in the labor movement in 1994, I assumed it would come fully loaded. Benefits just came with the job, after all, and I assumed mine would include health insurance, a retirement plan, and the protection of basic labor laws. I assumed that a safety net would be there if I needed it. I was wrong. America's safety net was already in free fall then. Today, it's almost gone entirely. The collapse of the safety net was no accident. It was the result of neglect on the left and sabotage on the right, and it has left us with a society exposed to risk to an unprecedented degree. For many workers in the United States, the severity of this decline has become obvious only recently. But the crisis we're in today has been a long time coming. I've been organizing freelancers for more than 25 years. They are the vanguard of the changing economics of work and have experienced the dissolution of the old safety net firsthand. In fact, my family had front row seats to the rise and fall of the safety net in the 20th century. That story of how America's workers first built a safety net for themselves and saw government scale that safety net through the New Deal, only to see it hollowed out from within beginning in the 1970s, starts with my great-grandmother's arrival in New York around 1900. It goes like this. I am the second Sara Horowitz in my family. The first Sara Horowitz was an immigrant, a garment worker who came to the United States from a small town on the Russian-Polish border around 1900 with her son, on the run from anti-Semites and looking for work. She settled in New York City and, like countless other new arrivals from Central Europe at the time, found work in the garment district on Manhattan's West Side, which at the time was a hive of activity concentrated into a few city blocks that produced much of the clothing worn in America. Immigrants like Sara often had worked as tailors in their home countries, designing and making whole garments, a dress, a shirt, a pair of pants, from scratch. This kind of work required skill and expertise. Each garment was literally tailor-made for a single, often wealthy client. But technology was changing, and the nature of work was changing with it. The Industrial Revolution meant that for the first time in history, it was possible to produce affordable, ready-made clothing at scale. Suddenly, more Americans than ever could afford to buy fashionable clothes for themselves, and making that clothing was too big a task for individual tailors. The era of mass-produced, low-cost clothing had arrived. So a new kind of worker, the assembly worker, was born. My great-grandmother did piecework, making specific parts of an item of clothing, not the whole thing. She might have sewn buttons onto dress bodices and sleeve cuffs, stooping over her detailed work for hours on end. She worked when the company needed her, but it often wasn't enough to make a decent living. She couldn't necessarily rely on having work every day. No one had thought much about what kinds of protections this new workforce might need, and the garment industry exploited that fact. Part of why business was booming in those years was that immigrant workers like Sara were cheap, and they worked hard. But there was good news coming for workers like Sara, too. Industrial workers were starting to build organizations that helped them protect one another from exploitation by their employers, and these new unions were becoming increasingly powerful. The needle unions that helped protect garment workers like Sara were among the most dynamic of them all. On June 3, 1900, around the time Sara would have landed in New York, representatives from 7 of these garment workers' unions met and agreed to found one of the great unions of the early labor movement, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU.